today's lecture is a continuation of some of the issues we were discussing with regard to gender. However, in the last lecture, what we did is largely conceptual, and in today's lecture, we will try to focus on India. And the additional thing that we're doing is looking at the women's movement. And again, like I said, you know, it's really practically impossible to give you a sense of the women's movement in a 2-hour lecture. So what I've tried to do is try to bring out some of the highlights and have a kind of framing argument for the nature of the women's movement and the issues that it has taken up. The other thing is that I'm also going to, I was sort of debating on going chronologically from the colonial to the contemporary. And I decided, just to sort of make it a little more interesting, I decided to go back and forth a little bit. So I'm going to begin with the contemporary, go back to the colonial, and see how the contemporary formations and the way in which the kinds of issues that we address through the women's movement have a resonance in what was going on in the colonial and, you know, what the political field has been like. But before I get into that, I just want to go through some of the things that we did in the last class. And primarily, you see this as a... may I request silence, please? Okay, since this is a 2-hour lecture and I really need to do quite a bit, and also I have videos, so I request you to not disturb the class. So, as we discussed, and this has been a continuing theme in our lectures in our discussions of kinship, of family, and the issue is of how patriarchal structures or patriarchy structures relationships within families. It structures intimate relationships and also structures sort of larger questions. So, for instance, you can look at the state as a capitalist state and the state as a patriarchal institution. So, in the last class, we spoke a little bit about the connections between gendered relations, between caste relations and patriarchy. So we discussed how that happens, and that basically that, if you look at the control of women happens through primarily through these intimate institutions and through and in intimate relationships. And that women play a significant role in maintaining caste. So the maintenance of caste boundaries to a large extent is dependent on and framed by what women do within caste groups. And there are two areas which make this relationship between caste and women visible. One is the domestic sphere, and this is where the intimate relationships, we talked about code and honor and so on, and the ownership and control over resources. Now, there are 3 contexts of control: food and commensality, sexuality and reproductive rights, and occupational continuity. Now, in all these 3 aspects, we find that there is a kind of overlap of gendered oppression and caste norms. So, for instance, then, if you look at occupational continuity, the example that I had given was how, when men migrate, it is left to the women to actually continue some of the caste occupations within the village. So, actually, the village structure and the caste structure in the village continues to be, is maintained through the work of the women. Sexuality and reproductive rights, we've dealt with this at length to show how the issue of purity and pollution frames how sexuality is controlled and how reproductive rights of women are controlled, so that it's important for men to be able to give away the reproductive rights of women, as well as to control, and tied to that is the control of sexuality, because it is only through that a particular caste group can be perpetuated. So, and the other is food and commensality. So the idea that it is, again, food is, if you look at the household and the structuring of the household, food and relations between people is something that women have control over. So, who comes to the house, what kind of utensil the person is served in, what kind of food the person is served, what kind of food is cooked. all of these are, become important, are framed by important rules of what is pure and what is polluting. So through sort of the last class, what we did was really to look at, fundamentally to look at how men and women are socially constructed. And when we see the context of India and the women's movement, you'll actually see many of these issues coming to the forefront, because basically the idea that this kind of construction, a certain construction of a gendered identity, happens in and through the families. So that women, the differences between men and women are socially constructed; they're not biologically determined. And the sort of additional point that we were trying to make is also about how biology is socially determined. So to a certain extent, what we think of as, in that sense, scientific and sort of not to be tampered with by social conditioning, even that can be socially conditioned. So the idea that how is it that we know a gender, and that is what I had tried to sort of get across to you in the last class, that you know your gender only through genitalia, whereas actually there can be many dimensions of physiological characteristics that constitute gender composition. We also sort of discussed how gender is learned and practiced in the day-to-day in relation to norms, scripts, and rules, and that gender is something that we produce, so that it is an accomplishment that we continually produce. Another view of this is that gender is that gender is performative. It is something that we do. Of course, we must remember that what we do is within that normative script. Now, gender, as I said, becomes a significant issue because what we think of as male-female differences or men-women differences do not remain at the realm of differences alone. They become inequality, so that these differences are hierarchically ordered. So that the study of gender is also about a study of stratification, or the study of inequalities and the kinds of inequalities that that women experience. So we talked a little bit about through the film about how when you look at technology and globalization and all these new forces, how they actually enable us to rethink gender. And partly the challenge then is to think of a world with the non-gender, and that's almost like an impossibility, because like I said, in every interaction, the first kind of identity that you try to place on a person is the person's gender. And so to imagine a situation where you wouldn't know whether a person is male or female, or you wouldn't be able to work with this kind of binary, is almost impossible. So in a radical kind of feminist statement, we could imagine a world where there would be no gender. Now, if you think of one of the sort of pivotal points around which our understanding of gender and our studies of gender is based, it's the idea of inequality. And I just want to leave you with two concepts which I think many of you will be doing later on in your respective courses, which is the concept of the Gender Development Index and the Gender Empowerment Measure. So basically, when we think of inequality, we have this concept of the gender gap, that in many aspects of development, in many aspects of life, men and women do not share the same plane. So that, if you look at indices of development, if you look at indices of life, women fare much worse than men. So whether it's looking at salaries, whether it's looking at life expectancy, whether it's looking at nature of work and all those conditions. Now, so our understanding of inequality is structured around fundamentally around, of course, around the differences between men and women, but that these differences between men and women are actually framed somewhat through work, through the fact that housework and women's work is deeply devalued, and so the sexual division of labor, both within the household as well as outside, frames how we look at look at inequality. So the control of work, the control of sexuality, and the separation between the private and the public domains frames issues of gender inequality. And so when we focus on gender, then partly what we're trying to do is we're trying to come to terms with and trying to understand, trying to organize concepts through which we can understand this inequality. And these two concepts, Gender Development Index and Gender Empowerment Measure, are sort of enabling to look at inequality. Now, Gender Development Index is a concept that comes from or emerges from the concept of the Human Development Index. And as you know, that measures life expectancy at birth, the literacy rate, and GDP per capita. Now, when you do this in terms of gender, you're basically just disaggregating in terms of gender. So the Gender Development Index is really an indicator which looks at those HDI indicators in terms of the differences between men and women. The gender empowerment measure, again, is an indicator that captures gender inequality, and it looks at largely at issues of, let's say, political participation and decision making. It looks at economic participation and how economic participation affects decision making powers of women, and the control and power over economic resources as measured by the income, earned income. Now, if you look at all of these three contexts, they're quite complicated because, as we know, just earning an income doesn't mean empowerment. So even if, so let's say, we discussed this a little bit in terms of when we discussed dowry. So that is dowry pre-mortem inheritance. So does it mean that, getting that dowry and getting that kind of, some kind of resource, does it have, but we see that actually women don't have control over it. Similarly, if you look at earned income, again, we may find that very often relations within the household are still structured along patriarchal lines, where a salary does not guarantee freedom to make certain choices, or the salary does not guarantee empowerment. So it's important then to look at these larger processes of inequality, where decision making, women's roles in politics, all of these are taken into account. Now, before I move on, and so then, if you look at the fact that these were the kinds of things that the gender question or the women's question frames, then clearly it's the women's movement was also is a movement that addressed. So that the fact of inequality, the fact of control over sexuality, control over one's body. So the idea that as individuals we do not have control over our bodies. That those were some of the things that the women's movement addressed. Now, broadly, in sort of largely in global terms, they're considered to be three sort of waves or stages of the feminist movement. Firstly, the suffragette movement. So basically, that initially what was, in the early 19th century, what was happening was the abolition of slavery, and this is in the West, of course, in America, where abolition of slavery and the attempt to get women to have voting rights. The second wave is a wave of heightened feminist consciousness, where again the focus was much more on equal privileges on a larger scale. So initially, where it was just the right to vote and to be recognized, therefore, as equal citizens. In the second phase, it sort of, it was more broad-based to include other forms, other rights as well. And the third wave, where actually there was more of an attempt to destabilize binaries, to destabilize existing categories, to destabilize, the understanding of patriarchy and so on. So that it was really an attempt to challenge structures of domination. So if you think of these three as sort of the stages that framed the women's movement, we can then see whether this translates, or how this translates into an Indian context. So I have these slides on the different kinds of feminisms and theoretical perspectives, which I'm I'm not going to get into at this point. I've sort of listed them and have some points in there for you to get a sense, and I will share this PPT with you eventually after today. So I'm not getting into it right now. If I have time at the end of the class, we could come back to this and discuss this. But right now, for the, in order to be able to finish what I'm going to say about the women's movement and the rest of the stuff, I'm going to leave this aside. I will begin this segment on what the women's movement in India was about with a short video with what you know by now is one of my favorite feminists.
मेरी बहनें मांगे, मेरी बच्ची मांगे, नारी का नारा, मजदूर का नारा, दलितों का नारा, आदिवासियों का नारा, जंगों से लेंगे, दंगों से लेंगे, हिंसा से लेंगे, अपमान से लेंगे, हम लेके रहेंगे, from patriarchy, from all hierarchy, from endless violence, from helpless silence, for walking freely, for talking freely, for dancing madly, for singing loudly, for self-expression, for celebration. We love it madly. Come say it loudly. Azadi.
So this is actually significant for me because I think it really addresses the range of different concerns that the women's movement had. So whether it's, whether it's in terms of the struggle for survival, whether it's in terms of, being able to walk the streets freely, to dance madly. So it's actually, it covers quite a broad range of issues that the women's movement has actually dealt with, from the pre-independence to the contemporary era. Now, in my discussion of the women's movement and its issues in India, I just want to say that it's going to be framed by these arguments. Firstly, that it is shaped by the nature of the political field. And there is a book by Raka Ray, it's called Fields of Protest. It's sort of an ethnographic work of two contexts. One is Bombay and the other is Calcutta. And she uses this concept of the political field, which is basically a kind of, it's like talking about the political culture of a place and how that political culture shapes movements. And one of the things she says is that the movement in Bombay and the movement in Kolkata are actually very different because Bombay had a deeply fragmented political field and Kolkata didn't. Kolkata had a kind of hegemonic political field because of the left rule for many, many years. So it's actually the left rule and left politics which framed the issues that the women's movement was taking up. So what we find then is that the issues that the women's movement in India takes up are heterogeneous. There's, again, like I said, it's a range of different issues and often fragmented, but they're always persistent. So that there is a kind, when we think of the women's movement, it's actually possible for us to think of sort of events or issues that are somewhat connected to each other, which gives us a sense of this movement. So from the sort of pre-independence period, we will see that women's issues were also issues of development, of the struggle for survival, of the everyday concerns that women had within the family, in their workplaces. So it was about, it was against alcohol, it was for employment or for their men, it was about water, making the state accountable for providing services and so on. So at all points, we see that, often when we think of the feminist question, and that the feminist question is to be articulated in terms of this a principle of gender justice or of equality between men and women, when we look at the women's movement and the range of issues that it addressed, you may not always find that. And sometimes, as we will see later on, there may even be a kind of opposition to those ideals. Now, the other thing that runs through the events and the context that I'm going to discuss, or the issues that we are going to discuss, is that there is the women's movement in India is deeply affected by the contradictions of tradition and modernity. So, and this you find resonance in the colonial period, because there is this idea of women's equality which is derived from Western rationalism, but it is occurring, so it is happening at a time when everything Western is actually being countered, is being challenged, right, through the through the sort of challenge to the British rule. So there is a felt need to assert distinctiveness from the West, but in terms of the feminist principles, there is a need to align oneself to, or align the movement to certain principles of Western rationalism. So there is this kind of struggle between tradition and modernity. The movement is also shaped, because it is shaped by the dominant political culture, because the dominant political culture affects the movement, there is this, again, this tension between whether it is totally shaped by the political culture or whether it is an autonomous movement. So the movement struggles to retain autonomy, as a feminist movement would aspire to do so, but it is also continually being shaped by the political culture, by the dominant political culture. And finally, 2 points which I'm going to try and work through by looking at this essay by Susie, Tharu and Niranjana, which I will circulate. It's a slightly difficult essay, but I hope that discussing it in the class will make it more accessible, is the idea of intersectionality. So that, and this is something that we've been trying to, I would like to connect the idea of intersectionalities to a point that I've been making in all my classes, is that the concept of embeddedness. That institutions, and when we look at institutions, they cannot just be seen in isolation, that they're embedded in each other. So when you think of women's lives and the understanding of women's inequalities, this is embedded in different kinds of institutional structures. So like I said, gender, caste, patriarchy. So patriarchy as a social institution, caste as a social institution, and gender, there is a kind of connectedness. So you cannot then see the way in which a woman feels oppressed within the family without understanding the family as a patriarchal institution, the state as a patriarchal institution which makes laws, and caste as a social institution which oppresses women and uses the notions of purity and pollution to oppress women and to perpetuate the caste group. So, so these intersectionalities have an effect on women's lives, and the concerns of the movement, have to address these intersectionalities. So often you will find, as again we will see through some of the examples, that sometimes this focus on gender leads to a process of othering. So, for instance, if you think of the Uniform Civil Code and the Shah Bano case, which we will discuss briefly, that is one example of how a focus on gender and principles of gender justice actually leads to a process of othering Islam, right? But let me just quickly, again, as I said, I would begin with certain examples of the contemporary movement. It's something that many of you, I'm sure, will relate to. And for that, I have, can I have silence, please? See, 2 videos which I'll show back to back. One is the Take Back the Night. It's like a report, NDTV report on. You're all familiar with Take Back the Night as a campaign. So Take Back the Night and Bell Bajao, which is a media campaign against violence against women. Now you see that these are the kinds of issues that civil society and the media are taking up, and in a sense the women's movement in India currently is framed, I think, in a large measure by the issue of violence against women.
talk outside. We are not safe anywhere. I don't feel safe walking even with my husband on the road.
I want to be honest here to say that I'm the last person who takes to protest. I'm a person who believes that there is a system and we can follow that. Protest is your last tool that you have. And the reason I took part in this protest is somewhere there is a comfort zone that you slipped into. Somewhere you believe that the other person will do it for you. You need to be there, and you need to, because it's all over Twitter. It's on Facebook. You're seeing it on TV. And you are in Delhi. So you want to be a part of what's happening around you. You are very keenly, anyways, attuned to the cause. So for the first time you felt that there is some issue which not only you felt but everybody around you is feeling. And the kind of people who were there, I'm sure, are the ones who find it difficult to get up on a Sunday morning to make an agenda of the day.
Amrita Bhindar's lathi-inflicted bruises might have begun to fade. But barricades along Rajpath, normal at this time of year in preparation for Republic Day, are up. As the dust settles along the most powerful boulevard in the country, the steel becomes a metaphor for the might of the state.
शांतिपूर्वक जो प्रदर्शन कर रहे थे उन पे आप देखिए खरीदारी हो जाएगा ऑर्डर ये किसने दिया हमने ऑर्डर किसने दिया आप ये बता सकते हैं
And its own fortification against an angry public that recently filled this exact space, making an ostensibly simple demand. Freedom enshrined in the Constitution of India and safety for India's women from sexual assault at home or outside.
शीला दीक्षित को वो आती है, वो जो कहती है बस तुम घर पे बैठो, घर पे बैठ के कब तक बैठ जाएंगी, वो खुद घर पे बैठती है, उसके पास तो 10 गाड़ियाँ आगे पीछे होती हैं.
The brutal gang rape of a 23-year-old girl on her way home from a movie on a December Sunday evening and her eventual death triggered an awakening that took many by surprise. Perhaps the simplest explanation was the sense of identification with her. The ordinariness of the evening, the girl, the movie she watched, and the aspirations she had for herself and what she represented for so many like her was all it took to say, enough is enough. The anger building up over years as crime after crime against women made headlines, finally boiling over. On a somber New Year's Eve this past December, a group of Delhi women organized a simple protest to take back the night, to raise their voice demanding justice for this girl and others like her, and against political leaders who offend our sensibilities by disgraceful, chauvinistic comments. The name of the movement aimed at reclaiming public spaces that are safe for women, inspired by similar movements across the globe that began in the 70s when feminists were taking the world by storm.
It's not as if there have not been protests. I think what to me is significant about this protest is that it is a very mixed group of people in terms of gender, in terms of class also, in terms of age profile as well, young and old, and their families. And they're all coming out to protest about what is seen as a women's issue. And this has never happened because by and large, issues to do with women are seen as the responsibility of women's groups as such. So there is that. There's also the fact that, the next generation of women down, say from my generation or the next generation after that, they have grown up taking for granted many of the things that we fought for. So to them, those things are not issues. But when things touch their own lives, because of course, victimization, oppression, all of that doesn't go away. And also, I think it's significant in this day and age for urban people to take a stand on issues of governance. I think that's quite significant, because it means that you feel that you can actually be at the edge of change.
India's #1 news app.
हिम्मत कैसे हुई तुम्हारी? How dare you?
क्या किया मैंने?
क्या किया? इस तरह से बात करती हो? What do you think of yourself?
मेरी क्या गलती है?
Shut up! Shut up! गलती अब मैं करता हूँ। झूठ बोलने की आदत पड़ गई है तुमको। Just because I don't say anything. तुमको बस एक ही भाषा समझ में आती है। एक और बार अगर ऐसा हुआ ना तो मैं
एक फोन कर सकता हूं? हेलो जी, हाँ, मैंने ही फोन किया था।
Bring domestic violence to a halt. Ring the bell.
Okay, so now the reason I wanted to actually, these two videos are interesting for me because I think that what they do is they really show us how, around what kinds of issues the civil society and media rally. And, among feminist circles, there has been this critique to this kind of rallying around, and one is not saying that it's not appropriate, but if you look at the fact that there are many other issues of, the rape of tribal women, the rape, and the kind of issues that rural women face, and it doesn't draw the same kind of response from the media or from civil society. So, and I think that in that NDTV report, the interesting thing for me is that what is it that enables this kind of a response from civil society? And partly, I think what they're saying is that this kind of ordinariness of the event, of what happened, that the fact that you get up feeling that it could have well happened to you, and so that kind of with that case, I think there was a kind of bridging of the distance that it doesn't happen to me. The ultimate, that kind of act is not going to happen to me. So that and that then brings, and of course the fact that it's it's over, it's a culmination of a number of different cases that happened in Delhi. So I think that largely then you see that there's also having taught in this undergraduate college, among many people actually people will say, well, I'm not a feminist, and it's almost like we encounter a generation where feminism becomes a bad word, conveying certain kinds of radicalisms which you don't want to be associated with. So it is in this context that we can see how these issues become sort of significant everyday issues for women that they may experience, and that is how they then respond, and what we have is this kind of a movement. So actually then largely speaking, feminist groups in the late 1990s and then in 2000, we find that this, the issue of violence against women is quite an issue to rally around. I'm going to show you two more videos. One is of the Gulabi gang, and the second one is a little piece on Bhavri Devi. Now Bhavri Devi is again very, very significant because it is through her and because of her story that the Vishakha judgment, which then became the sexual harassment, the act against sexual harassment, came to be instituted. So we will talk about that before, but let me just show you those two. This is just a clip from the film by Nishtha Jain.
हम दलितों की इसलिए लड़ाई लड़ रहे हैं कि मैं भी तो एक दलित हूँ। दलित जात से थोड़ी कोई होता है। दलित तो एक गरीबी से, जो महिलाएं सताई जाती हैं, जो गरीब सताए जाते हैं, वही एक दलित। हमारा देश पुरुष प्रधान था, लड़की का कोई बहिष्कार नहीं करता, लड़कियों को करता है। लड़की पैदा हो गई तो लोगों को दुख, बहू आ गई काम नहीं किया तो दुख, और नारी नारी की ही दुश्मन है। सबसे ज्यादा नारियों के लिए ही ये संगठन बनाया गया है कि पहले नारी जागृत है, इसलिए जरूरत थी। गुलाबी गैंग बनना चाहिए, महिलाओं को एकता होना चाहिए, और हर गांव में संगठन होना चाहिए, गांव नहीं बचना चाहिए। सब लोग अपने अपनी डंडी रख के आराम से बैठिए गोलाई से, ठीक? और दूर दूर थोड़ी तो कुआरी दाई का स्टार्ट कर गई। तो सब पुरानी हमारी संगठन वाली हो कि कुछ नई भी जुड़ी? सब पुरानी हो ना? हमें सभी जनती हो ना? पहली बात तो मैं एक आपसे बात बता दो, बड़ी घटना की बात है। जब सब जने मुझसे कहा कि दीदी बहुत दिन माई हो, पुरुष अगर एक पत्नी कर ले तो कोई उंगली नहीं उठा पाएगा, कि उठा पाता है? आप बताइए। लेकिन जब लड़की किसी से प्यार कर लेती है तो जानते हो कितने लोग उसके ऊपर ऑब्जेक्शन लगाते हैं, या तो अपनी आत्महत्या कर लेती या तो हत्या कर देंगे। तो एक तो महिलाओं के साथ अन्याय होता है। तो इसी तरह वो एक लड़की लड़का को चाहती थी, लेकिन वही का बाप विधायक गुंडों को लेकर तारा तोड़ के लाया, अपने घर में रखा। बीएसपी का विधायक, वर्तमान अभी का। इसके बाद वो गैंग रेप किया लड़की के, यानी बलात्कार। लेकिन अभी तो मैं अकेली लड़ रही हूँ, अगर जरूरत है तो सबकी जरूरत है। अगर आप फोन कर देना, हम सबको लेके आएंगे। ऐसी बड़ी बात से मालूम हो सके जहाँ है करना मजा थोड़ा लाठी सीखे होती। हाँ लाठी। अच्छा एक जनी खड़ी हो, चलो बेटा तुम भी खड़ी हो, तू जनी खड़ी हो, मैं क्या तो तुम्हारा लाठी कौन का नाम? चलो निकिता नहीं, निकिता चलाओ, निकिता ना अच्छे से। अरे घूम घूम के चलाओ ना। ये साड़ी मामी गिर गई तो देख लड़ाई में चप्पल टूट।
It was just here at this farmland where in 1992 Bhavri Devi was brutally gang raped by the upper caste men of her village. Bhavri hasn't forgotten. She comes here every day to keep those horrific memories alive. She wants justice. There were 5 men. 2 of them held my husband and the other 3 raped me. Bhavri's only fault was that she had dared to stop a 9-month-old girl from being married into the house of an upper caste villager. They said it's a matter of pride. How can a Dalit stop a wedding of the Gujars? From the police, who initially refused to write her FIR, to the villagers who ostracized her family, Bhavri has faced opposition and humiliation. Called a liar as her dignity was shred into pieces. Worse, the Sessions Court acquitted the accused in 1995. A nationwide campaign for justice for Bhavri Devi followed. Women's group got together and filed a PIL at the Supreme Court under the collective platform called Vishakha. It was this movement that resulted in the popular Vishakha guidelines on sexual harassment, a significant milestone in Bhavri Devi's fight for justice. Her husband, who stood by her through her battle, continues to support her. But the only source of income for this couple is the honorarium of 500 rupees per month that Bhavri Devi gets from the Mahila Vikas Samiti. Bhavri now runs a self-help group with other women for her community and works with an NGO to support her family. 20 years have passed by, much has been written and said about Bhavri since. But little has changed for the woman who dared to speak against the rich and the powerful. She is still ostracized by the villagers.
50 साल में देखो सरकार न्याय ले छोड़ा, चुप नहीं बैठा, आखिर में ये बात तो देना पड़ा उन्हें.
Okay, so Bhavri Devi was a Sathin, and when she was going to prevent this child marriage, it was argued that was her workplace, and that was the basis for the Vishakha judgment, because she was raped in the context of her workplace, and that's what women's groups articulated, the need for then a law to protect women in their workplaces. There is another interesting, I think, aspect to the case is, the accused in the case were acquitted, and actually they were acquitted on grounds that Bhavri Devi, being a Dalit woman, the court ruled that it was upper caste men. The accusation was against upper caste men. So how could upper caste men actually touch a Dalit woman, let alone rape her? So it's interesting. So this is what I was trying to say at the beginning, that the intersectionalities of caste and gender frame the way in which issues of the movement have been dealt with, and issues of the movement are articulated, or the women's question is articulated at different points in time by different institutions. So in this case, the court was actually using the caste narrative over and above the narrative of gender justice, and therefore ruling in favor of the upper caste. What about? Yeah, there wasn't any, right? So that's the point, that Bhavri Devi, in that sense, she didn't get justice. So justice has eluded her in that sense. Yeah. So now, what I'm going to do is just sort of step back and look into what the context was in the beginnings of the women's movement. And as we know, the beginnings of the women's movement can be located in the context of the colonial encounter and the struggle for independence. So actually, women who were fighting for or articulating the rights of women in the colonial period were also women who were involved in the freedom struggle. So actually, then the struggle for independence frames in a certain way the context of women's rights and how they're going to be articulated. So we make, in looking at the women's movement and the history of the women's movement, we actually make a distinction between the pre-independence and the post-independence phases in India. And the experience of the colonial encounter has a formative influence on how the issues are framed. So the social, and it's linked to these three contexts, that of revivalism, nationalism, and social reform. So many of the issues that women experienced in the colonial period were being articulated through social reformers. But there was also these two trends of revivalism and nationalism. Now, revivalism was basically the idea that that we needed to present the glory of Indian civilization and Indian society. That somewhere in the encounter in the colonial encounter, the Indian society was being seen as a society with all these decadent customs, and therefore that there was a way in which we had to revive the glory of India's past, and that was the revivalism movement. And then along with that, of course, you had the nationalistic sentiments where there was this struggle for independence. So both the social reform movements as well as the political challenges of the independence movement were critical in framing the women's question and the women's movement and the issues of the women's movement in before independence. So the social reformers in were especially active in Bengal and Maharashtra, and British relations in both these states had actually begun much earlier than in the rest of India. So possibly again here we see that the colonial encounter had something to do with the sort of the social reformers being more active in these places. So the Indian social reform movement then grew out of this colonial encounter. So this connection between principles of equality, of gender justice, and of social reform with the colonial encounter can't be ignored. So the Indian bourgeois society then attempted to develop under Western domination, and they attempted to reform itself by addressing issues of parda, or holding campaigns against caste, against child marriage, against sati. Now again, all these were issues of women, right? But they were fundamentally being taken up often to begin with by male social reformers, and then you had again women figures who became active as well. Can I have silence again? Okay. So all of this, whether you look at child marriage or sati or parda, all these were seen as pre-modern, as primitive, and as part of this pre-modern primitive identity. So the attempt to come out of this, to sort of deal with this and to challenge these practices, could be seen in terms of certain Western rationalistic ideas, right, of equality and so on. And therein lies the sort of counter through the revivalist movement, to say that that if you look at revivalist movement and nationalism, that the ideals of nationalism were actually to counter the West and the Western ideals. So to a certain extent, there is a kind of contradiction in the way in which the issues of the women's movement get framed in the colonial period. And I think if you look at what is happening, if you look at the contemporary situation, you will find a similar kind of a similar kind of tension in the political climate, which affects how these issues get framed. So at no point do we have a kind of clear articulation of a certain issue, because every articulation of the gender issue is actually ridden with all these other identities and the problems with all these other identities. So partly then this kind of problematic of gender caste, of gender and class, of caste class, of tribe, of rural urban, that I mentioned when I showed you those videos, is something that emerges from a political field that partially we have inherited, right? Yeah. That what? Yeah, no, can I just clarify? What he's trying to say is that do we need to see this in terms essentially of a Western intervention which prompted this kind of, that's what your question is, right? And I'm not trying to say that at all. What I'm trying to sensitize you to is the fact that we cannot actually see it in terms of one or the other. Therefore, that's why I mentioned the concept of political field. So a field is a certain kind of structuring of relations, right? And again, here, if you think of what all we've done in our discussions of social institutions, we have implicitly is this kind of relationship between structure and agency. So when we talk of a field, we think that there is a kind of structuration of the issues that people were dealing with or the issues that people were raising, and that structuration is there. But again, there is also a context for women's agency within that. So to think of, therefore, the social reform movement and the kinds of issues that were being taken up by the social reform movement and their connection to what we would call the women's question, that this is tied essentially to the encounter with the colonial encounter and the encounter with Western rationalism is, of course, is flawed, because again that looks at one side of it. So but again to say that the social reformers were not influenced at all by Western ideals is not appropriate either. So there is a kind of when you think of when we talk of sort of globalization and the connections between global and local contexts today, but there is a way in which histories have shaped, so that there is a historical and geographical location of these questions and how they emerge. So partly the reason I'm trying to focus a little bit on this is to just give you the context, the historical and geographical location in which the context that we speak of today, whether it's violence against women, whether it's take back the night, whether it's being able to walk the streets freely, all of this there is a context to it in our history and in our geographical location. So to merely to say that, why can it not just be our agency, and why do we have to essentially see it in terms of Western rationalism? I think there is a problem there as well. So one is not saying one or the other, right? One is trying to communicate to you that both those things were going on, that there were social reformers who were interested, who definitely saw these as problems of Indian society, right? As issues that needed to be addressed, and they did address it. But that the colonial encounter was a kind of catalyzing force cannot also be denied. And I think partly that's why I bring up this issue of, let's look at Bombay and Maharashtra and West Bengal and Bombay and Calcutta presidencies as places where they started initially, and not in other places. So the history of the social reform movement in both these places is more vibrant than in other contexts.